Imagine a world where kids raced down the street on bikes with no helmets, where neighbors didn't knock before stepping through the back door, and where trust wasn't just a word, it was the way people lived. For the baby boomer generation, this wasn't unusual. It was life as they knew it. Streets were filled with children playing tag or stickball until the last trace of sunlight disappeared, and nobody worried about constant supervision. Parents trusted the neighborhood, and the neighborhood, in turn, looked out for the children. To younger generations today, the idea feels almost reckless, but for boomers, it was normal. Back then, doors often stayed unlocked, even overnight. There was no need for deadbolts or cameras mounted above porches. People trusted the rhythm of their community, believing that safety came not from gadgets or alarms, but from knowing the people who lived on either side of the street. If a stranger lingered too long, someone always noticed, but the default setting was openness, not suspicion. Kids grew up with a freedom that would raise eyebrows now. They ran barefoot through grass, skinned their knees on sidewalks, and quenched their thirst by leaning over garden hoses that sputtered with cool, metallic-tasting water. Parents weren't hovering nearby with hand sanitizer. They were often inside, trusting that their kids would come home when they were hungry or when the streetlights flickered on. That simple call of dusk was enough to gather children from across the block, a silent signal everyone understood. Even hitchhiking, now seen as dangerous, carried no stigma. Teenagers stuck out their thumbs on highways or back roads, and drivers often stopped, giving them a lift without hesitation. It was part of a shared understanding that people needed each other, and that most strangers were simply neighbors you hadn't met yet. Today, such an act feels reckless, but in the world of boomers, it was a sign of trust and connection. This sense of ease extended far beyond childhood games or teenage adventures. It shaped the way families, friends, and neighbors interacted with each other. Communities weren't bound together by contracts or security systems. They were stitched together by trust. When someone knocked, it wasn't to sell something. It was to return a borrowed tool, share a plate of cookies, or simply chat about the weather. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize those years, but it's also clear that they belonged to a different time. Fear was quieter, news traveled slower, and people leaned on one another in ways that seem rare today. What modern generations might see as risky, boomers experienced as freedom, a kind of freedom tied not just to the absence of rules, but to the presence of trust. But as society shifted, what once felt ordinary began to look risky through modern eyes. Discipline looked very different in the boomer years, and it would probably make headlines today. In homes across America, parents often reached for the belt or the wooden spoon, and few questioned whether it was the right thing to do. Spanking wasn't whispered about in hushed tones or debated on television panels. It was simply a tool many parents used to keep children in line. Teachers, too, sometimes kept a paddle behind their desks, a silent reminder that misbehavior at school could bring consequences that stung long after recess ended. For boomers, this was not considered cruel, but a normal part of growing up. Supervision was equally relaxed, if not non-existent. Parks and playgrounds buzzed with children clambering over monkey bars and spinning on metal merry-go-rounds that seemed to defy safety. Parents didn't hover nearby with sunscreen or snacks. They stayed home, trusting that the community itself provided enough watchful eyes. Scraped knees and bruises were part of childhood, not reasons for lawsuits. Freedom and risk walked hand in hand, teaching lessons that came not from warnings, but from experience. Then there were the latchkey kids, a phrase that boomers wear like a badge of independence. Many children walked home from school with a house key tied around their neck, letting themselves into an empty home. Parents were still at work, so the afternoon was theirs to manage. Homework, snacks, maybe some television, it was all unsupervised. Younger generations today might find this shocking, but for boomers, it was a normal rhythm, one that instilled self-reliance early. Responsibility wasn't something waiting for adulthood. It arrived in childhood. Chores were expected, from mowing the lawn to babysitting younger siblings. Allowances were modest, if they existed at all, but the sense of contribution was real. Carrying part of the family load wasn't a choice, it was a given. Kids learned quickly that everyone had a role to play, whether in the household or the wider community. And when the day was done, there was no debate about screen time or bedtime routines. The signal was universal. When the streetlights came on, playtime was over. Children scattered from yards and sidewalks, rushing home before the first scolding could be heard. That glowing bulb overhead wasn't just a light. It was a cultural clock that bound entire neighborhoods together. Underlying all of this was a deep respect for authority. Teachers, parents, coaches, even older neighbors, all were figures children were taught to listen to without question. Backtalk wasn't tolerated, and obedience was often valued as much as creativity or curiosity. While modern parenting debates center on self-expression and boundaries, Boomer households leaned firmly toward discipline and respect. To many today, these habits seem harsh, even shocking. Yet they also forged a generation that learned resilience and independence in ways few modern children experience. Childhood for Boomers was tougher, freer, and undeniably different. And while childhood looked tougher, daily life for adults had habits that feel just as shocking. Seatbelts? Car seats? For Boomers, those were optional if they were even around. A family car in the 1960s or 70s was less a safety capsule and more a rolling living room. Children piled into the back without a second thought, sometimes lying across the seats, sometimes standing up to get a better view out the window. Parents rarely insisted they sit still because there were no booster seats or buckles to click. Freedom inside the car mirrored the freedom outside of it, and few questioned whether it was dangerous. Riding in the back of pickup trucks was a thrill many Boomers remember with a grin. Summer evenings meant kids bouncing along gravel roads, hair whipping in the wind, holding on to nothing but a sense of adventure. It wasn't considered risky. It was just part of childhood. Today, such a sight might cause drivers to reach for their phones to call the police. But back then, it was simply normal. Cars weren't just for getting places, they were for living in. Parents lit cigarettes with the windows rolled up, smoke curling around children strapped into nothing at all. Ashtrays filled on long road trips, and the smell of tobacco became as much a part of the car as the vinyl seats. For kids, the experience was unforgettable. The sweet burn of secondhand smoke mixing with the static of AM radio, the sound of laughter and the hum of tires on the highway. Road trips themselves were long, sprawling journeys across state lines, with children stretched out across the back seat, sometimes even napping on the ledge behind the rear window. Seatbelts existed in some cars, but many didn't use them. Parents believed a firm arm across the chest was enough to hold a child back in a sudden stop. The very idea of strapping a toddler into a specially designed seat for hours would have seemed foreign. Teenagers joined the world of driving much earlier, too. 16 was the rite of passage, but many practiced long before that on country roads or in empty parking lots. Driving wasn't just a skill. It was a symbol of independence, and parents often encouraged it. Keys were handed over more easily, and freedom came earlier than it does today, when insurance rates and safety rules weigh heavily on young drivers. And then there was the casual attitude toward drinking and driving. It wasn't celebrated, but it wasn't always condemned either. A couple of beers at the bar, then a drive home, was far more common than it is now. The culture placed trust in the individual, assuming they knew their own limits. The risks were real, but the social stigma wasn't as strong, making it a habit that feels shocking when viewed through today's lens. Looking back, Boomer driving habits seem reckless, even alarming, but they also paint a picture of a time when freedom was prized over caution, and rules were looser in every corner of life. But the car wasn't the only place Boomers lived differently. Their homes held shocking habits too. From wood-paneled basements to cigarette smoke curling in the living room, boomer homes were filled with habits that younger generations today find almost unbelievable. Step inside a typical house from the 1960s or 70s, and you'd likely be greeted by the smell of tobacco woven into the carpet and curtains. Ashtrays sat on every end table, often overflowing after parties where nearly everyone lit up indoors. No one thought much about secondhand smoke, and children played or watched TV while clouds drifted lazily through the air. The houses themselves carried hidden dangers that no one recognized at the time. Walls painted with lead-based paint, floors covered in asbestos tiles. These were standard materials, not health hazards. Parents didn't hover over warning labels, because most labels didn't exist. What mattered more was whether the living room looked tidy, the lawn was trimmed, and the kids were home in time for supper. The risks we obsess over today were invisible then, wrapped in the ordinary comfort of suburban life. Entertainment inside the home was simple, but it carried no limits. Kids planted themselves in front of the family television, a hulking piece of furniture with knobs you had to turn by hand. Cartoons in the morning, sitcoms at night, there were no timers, no debates about screen addiction. The TV wasn't seen as a threat to childhood. It was a gathering place, a reward, and sometimes a babysitter. Parents rarely counted the hours their children sat glued to glowing screens because everyone else's kids were doing the same. Another surprising detail? Coffee wasn't just for adults. Many boomers remember sipping from their parents' mugs at surprisingly young ages, a splash of milk added but little else to hide the bitterness. It wasn't too unusual for a teenager to start the day with a cup of coffee before school, and no one thought twice about the caffeine. Still, amid the casual habits, some traditions gave boomer homes a deep sense of togetherness. Dinner around the table every night was not optional, it was a ritual. Families gathered as a unit, passing dishes of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, or casseroles, catching up on the day's events. Phones didn't interrupt meals, and television sets were often turned off during dinner. These nightly gatherings stitched families together in ways that feel rare now. And then there was the neighborly culture that surrounded those homes. People didn't text before stopping by, and they knocked on the door, sometimes without even that courtesy. A neighbor might drop in to return a borrowed rake, deliver fresh-baked bread, or simply chat for a few minutes. Privacy fences and doorbell cameras were unnecessary because the expectation was openness, not guardedness. Communities were built not just on streets, but in living rooms and kitchens, with a constant flow of visitors who felt as comfortable as family. Boomer home life was equal parts carefree and connected, with habits that today seem reckless, but also deeply human. And if the house looked different, so did what went into the shopping cart. From Jell-O salads with marshmallows to Spam sandwiches on white bread, boomer diets are a shock to modern health trends. Step into a kitchen in the 1960s or 70s and you find refrigerators and cupboards packed with foods that today would send dietitians into a panic. Processed meals ruled the table. TV dinners, aluminum trays filled with meatloaf, peas, and a square of brownies were a symbol of convenience and modern life. Families gathered around the television with matching trays balanced on their laps, eating in unison while their favorite shows flickered in black and white. Breakfast was no different. Cereal aisles exploded with boxes that shouted at kids with bright cartoon mascots, promising sugar-coated happiness in every bowl. Saturday mornings often began with a mountain of Frosted Flakes or Fruit Loops, the milk turning neon colors as children shoveled spoonful after spoonful into their mouths. Parents rarely worried about sugar content, believing that a full stomach was enough to get kids through the day. Drinks were just as sugary. Kool-Aid, mixed from packets of powder and scoops of sugar, was a staple in countless homes. Soda wasn't a treat for special occasions. It was a regular part of family meals. Glass bottles clinked in the fridge, ready to be popped open with dinner or sipped on a hot afternoon. Nobody read labels for calories or grams of sugar. The idea of hydrating with water seemed almost laughable when sweet, colorful options were always within reach. Cooking itself leaned heavily on butter and lard. Frying, baking, sautéing, no meal seemed complete without a generous scoop of one or the other. Margarine tubs sat on kitchen counters, ready to spread across toast or melt into vegetables. Today's obsession with olive oil, avocado oil, or plant-based substitutes would have been unrecognizable to the boomer household. Richness was the goal, not heart health. School lunches offered no escape from the indulgence. Mystery meat, sloppy joes, tater tots, and chocolate milk cartons filled cafeteria trays. There were no strict nutrition rules or calorie counts taped to the wall. Kids ate what was served, and most of it was heavy, salty, or fried. For many boomers, those meals are remembered with equal parts fondness and disbelief at what passed for balanced food. And perhaps most surprising of all, there was no obsession with organic, gluten-free, or all-natural. Food was food. If it came from a can, a box, or a frozen package, it was modern and convenient. Health fads had yet to arrive, and labels were simple. Families trusted brands and jingles, not ingredient lists. Looking back, boomer diets were colorful, indulgent, and often questionable by today's standards. They reflect the time when convenience mattered more than nutrition, and taste often trumped caution. The meals may have been heavy and sugar-filled, but they carried the flavor of a simpler, less complicated era. And while the food was different, the way they worked was just as surprising. For boomers, work wasn't just a paycheck, it was identity. That mindset shocks many young people today, who are more likely to view jobs as stepping stones rather than lifelong commitments. In the boomer era, it was common to spend decades, sometimes an entire career, with a single company. That kind of loyalty wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. The gold watch at retirement symbolized not just years of service, but a life defined by consistency and dedication. The phrase, "paying your dues," carried real weight. Young employees knew they'd start at the bottom, often with little recognition, and work their way up slowly. Advancement wasn't about changing jobs. It was about proving yourself over years, sometimes decades. Promotions came as rewards for perseverance, not as quick responses to ambition. To modern workers accustomed to fast-paced career shifts, that slow climb seems both admirable and unthinkable. Overtime, too, was part of the culture. Staying late at the office or putting in extra hours on the factory floor wasn't framed as exploitation. It was seen as proof of character. The idea of leaving at 5 sharp every day would have been labeled as laziness or lack of commitment. Sacrificing evenings and weekends for the sake of the job was not only common, it was respected. Work-life balance, a phrase tossed around constantly today, was almost non-existent. The job came first, often at the expense of personal time, hobbies, or even family moments. Vacations were short, and many people didn't take all the days they were entitled to. Providing for the household was seen as a higher duty than personal leisure. For many boomers, identity as a worker was inseparable from identity as a spouse or parent. Even manual labor was approached with pride rather than complaint. Construction crews, factory workers, and tradesmen often embraced the grind of physical work, seeing it as a badge of honor. Calloused hands and tired backs were proof of effort, not signs of suffering. The dignity of labor was deeply ingrained, creating a generation that measured worth not by luxury but by endurance. Underlying all of it was a deep pride in providing. Whether it was keeping a roof over the family's head, putting food on the table, or saving for college, the role of worker was tied directly to the role of provider. Sacrifice was expected, and success was measured by stability, not by freedom or flexibility. Today, younger generations often push back against these values. prioritizing balance, mental health, and fulfillment over loyalty and long hours. Yet looking back, the boomer work ethic reflected a cultural moment when duty and sacrifice were woven into the very fabric of adulthood. It wasn't perfect, but it built families, neighborhoods, and industries with a level of commitment rarely seen now. But work wasn't everything. Boomers knew how to have fun in ways that shock people now. Entertainment didn't come from phones. It came from freedom, danger, and sometimes chaos. For boomers, fun was less about screens and more about experiences, many of which would make parents and safety experts today shake their heads in disbelief. Childhood and teenage years were wide open, and the lack of constant supervision meant kids invented their own adventures, often with a streak of recklessness. One of the purest joys was hopping on a bike and disappearing for hours. No helmets, no GPS trackers. No worried parents following up with text messages. Kids could ride for miles with friends, exploring neighborhoods, empty lots, and wooded trails until the streetlights told them it was time to head home. That kind of independence feels almost mythical to younger generations who rarely leave home without a phone. Then there were lots of fireworks. Backyard displays, bottle rockets, sparklers waved around by kids barely old enough to tie their shoes. It wasn't unusual for teens to buy firecrackers, light them off in the driveway, and laugh when things went a little out of control. Fire safety regulations were looser, and so was the attitude toward risk. Parties brought their own kind of shock factor. Smoking and drinking often started at surprisingly young ages, and it wasn't hidden away from adults the way it might be today. Cigarettes and cheap beer were practically rites of passage, and social gatherings from basements to barns were often hazy with smoke. For teens, one of the biggest social hubs was the drive-in theater. Piling into cars, sneaking extra friends in the trunk, and catching the latest movie under the stars became a cultural ritual. It wasn't just about the film. It was about being with peers, flirting, and having a little bit of freedom away from home. Even simple mischief was part of the fun. Prank calls made on rotary phones, ding-dong ditch escapades, and harmless stunts around the neighborhood were seen as normal kid behavior. The consequences were usually light, maybe a scolding, maybe a laugh. Unlike today, few worried about lasting records or legal trouble for childish antics. At the heart of boomer fun was community. Social life revolved around school dances, block parties, church picnics, and local fairs. Everyone knew each other, which made gatherings feel safe and familiar, even when the activities themselves carried risks. Entertainment was shared, physical, and immediate, not filtered through a screen or an app. Looking back, it's easy to see how much joy came from that freedom, even if it came with danger. To young people today, the idea of roaming for hours, lighting fireworks, or sneaking into a drive-in without anyone checking in might sound reckless, but for boomers, it was simply life. But while their fun might shock us, their habits around money might shock even more. Boomers lived in a world where one income could buy a house, and debt looked very different. For many families, the financial landscape of the mid-20th century was built on stability and predictability, something younger generations today often find hard to imagine. Money stretched further, costs were lower, and the way people managed their finances reflected a culture that prized security over constant consumption. Housing was the clearest example. A single breadwinner could often afford a modest home, complete with a yard, a garage, and enough space to raise a family. Mortgage rates could still be high at times, but the price of property relative to income made ownership attainable for the average worker. College followed the same pattern. Affordable tuition meant students could pay as they went or graduate with only small debts, a contrast that feels staggering when compared to the student loan burdens of today. Credit looked different too. Plastic cards were only beginning to appear in wallets, and most purchases were still made with cash or checks. Shopping trips often meant balancing the family budget in real time, rather than relying on revolving credit lines. Debt carried a certain stigma. It wasn't something to lean on casually, but rather something to manage carefully. Savings played a central role in financial life. Many families kept a nest egg tucked away, whether in a bank account or even in cash at home. Children were taught the value of putting coins into piggy banks, learning early that saving was a virtue. The mindset was one of preparation and discipline. A rainy day fund wasn't optional, it was expected. Of course, frugality was balanced with moments of indulgence. Boomers splurged on vacations, new appliances, or the occasional night out, but those purchases carried more weight. They were milestones, not everyday occurrences. Buying a television or a new car felt celebratory, not routine. For workers, retirement wasn't always a matter of individual planning. Company pensions offered security, tying long-term loyalty at work to a future guarantee of stability. The idea of managing one's own retirement funds with 401(k)s and investment portfolios had not yet become the norm. That security fostered a different relationship with work and money, one less burdened by uncertainty about old age. Taken together, the boomer financial world feels both familiar and foreign. The principles of saving, frugality, and planning endure, but the affordability and structure of the economy have shifted so dramatically that younger generations often struggle to picture it. What once felt like a given buying a home, graduating debt-free, retiring on a pension now feels, to many, like an impossible dream. And yet, beneath all these habits lies something bigger, a cultural difference that defines generations. Maybe their habits shock us, but they also remind us of a world where trust, freedom, and resilience mattered most. Looking back at the way boomers lived, it's easy to focus on the risks, the lack of safety nets, and the choices that feel unthinkable now. Yet woven into those habits was a deeper lesson. Life was about finding strength in independence, leaning on community, and embracing the simple joys that made everyday moments unforgettable. The independence boomers grew up with wasn't just about roaming neighborhoods unsupervised or learning responsibility. Early it built a resilience that carried into adulthood. They were taught to solve problems, to get back up after falling, and to rely on their own grit. That kind of toughness may feel out of step in today's carefully managed world, but it left behind a blueprint for self-reliance that still matters. At the same time, the community held everything together. Neighbors who walked in uninvited, families who gathered at the dinner table, kids who knew they could run down the block and find someone to play with. These weren't just casual habits. They were reminders that connection was once built into the fabric of daily life. Even without smartphones or social media, people stayed close, and that closeness gave life a richness that technology struggles to replace. There's also something powerful about the simplicity of their joys. Riding a bike, watching a drive-in movie, sharing a soda with friends, none of it required elaborate planning or endless spending. Compared to today's endless options and constant noise, those small pleasures seem almost profound. They remind us that happiness doesn't always need complexity. It often comes from freedom and presence. Of course, the risks can't be ignored. Hitchhiking, smoking everywhere, cars without seatbelts, those freedoms carried dangers. But within that risk was also a sense of trust, both in themselves and in others, that shaped how they saw the world. That balance between risk and resilience is a delicate one, but it explains why so many boomers carry their childhood memories with pride, even when those same habits raise eyebrows today. In the end, nostalgia isn't about recreating the past. It's about carrying forward the best of it. We don't need to bring back every habit, but we can preserve the values underneath them: independence, resilience, connection, and joy in simplicity. If we remember those lessons while moving forward with progress and safety, then the spirit of the boomer years doesn't fade. So tell me, what boomer habit shocked you the most?